So there's a little bit of irony in being here. I've only given one other talk here, and that was about 10 years ago, and it was 3 days after I had a kidney stone removed. And so I'm working on my talk this weekend, and suddenly, So the good news is that Eric Forsman has agreed to, if I keel over suddenly up here, to take over for me and finish this talk. But I want to talk about small mammals in a general sense, sort of what we've learned. I've done a lot of work up in Washington, but I think a lot of the same stuff applies to the west side of Washington and Oregon. And the small mammal community, each species has its own ecological value, but there's two main ones from a management perspective that seem to be important. And the first one is that a lot of these species serve as prey for our higher vertebrate predators, including spotted owls. And the second aspect of the small mammal community is that they're really right in the middle of some complex trophic webs that we have in the Northwest, so they can serve as an indicator for overall forest health in some cases. So take the flying squirrel, for instance. It's fed on by spotted owls. The flying squirrel, in turn, eats fungi. The fungi is required for tree growth in the region, so there's some pretty tight webs of relationships there that are important. And what we've really been trying to do in a lot of our areas is take relatively structurally and biologically simple small stands, or simple stands, and create complex stands out of that. And so as we look at the small mammal community, you can sort of think of them in three components. At the bottom, we've got sort of the ground voles, the shrew moles, the shrews, that really focus most of their life history at or even sometimes below the ground of the surface. The second level up are things like chipmunks and deer mice that use both the ground and the tree and seem to be quite diverse in their ability, but still tend to spend much of their time focused on the ground as an important part of what they use. The third group is the tree squirrels. And at the highest level is these tree voles that, in some cases are an extreme in that individuals could spend their entire life in a single tree. Flying squirrels spend about only 10% of their time on the forest floor and 90% of their space and time in use up in the canopy. So in a general sense, what we've learned, at least for effects of thinning up to, say, 15, 20 years after thinning, is that this stuff at the bottom layer, the chipmunks and the voles and the shrews, have either increased positively in response, because most of what has changed in that short term is the understory shrubs and plants. And since those species are keying in on there, they're either going to respond positively or in some cases neutrally, but at least in comparison to what we would expect in complex forests, they haven't really dropped below that. So the question really is, what about at the top of this, these animals that are really dependent on tree use? Well, the short story is that most of our thinning that has gone on in the Northwest has had very negative effects on these species. And this becomes very important because, especially with the tree voles and the flying squirrels, they serve as important prey for spotted owls. So as we start to work under the Northwest Forest Plan to try to keep owls on the landscape, it's important that we try to figure out ways to keep their prey on the landscape as well. This is an example of a study in young forest on Fort Lewis, where we did some experimental variable density thinning that goes all the way back to 1991 from Andy Carey's work. And you can disregard the complexity of these lines, but basically each of these lines follows 4 stands representing their mean with the error bars. And in 1991, we collected pretreatment data. We thinned in 1993. As you follow it through time, if you notice the general curve, shortly after thinning, all of our stands, even control stands, dropped to virtually nothing, recovered at least compared to controls. And then we had a few years where we didn't sample, but when we came back at the end, we had virtually nothing. And so the questions that arise is like, well, why? Because we're doing these variable density thinnings to promote flying squirrel habitat, among other things, and yet we're seeing almost nothing on the landscape. Well, if we look at all the studies that have been done over the last quarter century, most of them have come up with all kinds of associations, whether it be large coarse-woody debris, abundant coarse-woody debris, ericaceous shrubs, nearness to conifers, and so forth. And from a management standpoint, it becomes very difficult to say, well, is there any ubiquitous measures that we can use to help manage for, at least in the short term, to kind of help support spotted owl prey? Well, one of the issues that has happened in the past is that we've really oftentimes did more of an ANOVA style analysis where we compared, say, young versus old, and we grouped all the variation within those stands. And in general, I think the things that come out is that older forests, yes, in general, do support higher numbers of squirrels than younger forests. However, it's not exclusive. We've got a lot of examples of older forests that don't support high abundances, and conversely, we have a lot of younger stands that do support high abundances. And so as part of my doctoral work, I sort of reversed this picture, because often we say, okay, we found an association with large snags. Large snags are used as dens, therefore dens must be an important limiting factor. Well, I took and sort of reversed that, and I said, okay, what are the 4 major limiting factors, apart from fragmentation, that have been coming out in the literature based on all these work that everyone has been doing? And that includes food, which fungi is a main diet of flying squirrels. Dens, flying squirrels use snags, but 2/3 of what we found in the Northwest were actually live trees. They also use external stick nests. Predation, owls and weasels are the primary predators. And competition, probably from closely related species like Douglas squirrels and chipmunks. And you know, the bottom line, or one of the things that came out of that multivariate analysis, was that out of 33 structurally diverse stands, in other words, I went through and found as much diversity in terms of lots of coarse-woody debris, little coarse-woody debris, lots of snags all the way down to nothing, lots of canopy gaps down to really closed canopy forests. And I tried to find the widest gradient of stands that I could in western Washington. And out of those 33 stands, 32 of them I could correctly classify as either supporting lots of squirrels or no squirrels by these 3 variables. Canopy gaps, which I defined as areas at least 10 meters by 10 meters that didn't have trees larger than 10 centimeter DBHs. And 10-meter intercept. So if you sliced the forest at 10 meters above the ground and intercepted either canopies or boles, if you summed all that up, the amount of intercept that you have, whereas the higher the intercept, the more likely you'd have high abundances. I should go back to the gaps and say that the more gaps you had, the lower the abundances. And the third is variance in live tree DBH. To give you an example, these are 13-hectare stands, each of these green spots. And this top row represents the top stands that had the highest abundances, like 3 or 4 squirrels per hectare. And each of the white dots, the smallest white blob is 10 meters by 10 meters. So you can see a very clear difference across the top between those top 3 stands in terms of the canopy gaps and the sizes of gaps and the numbers of gaps across that stand relative to this bottom 3 rows. If you look at the intercept layer, as you slice layers across the trees, the blue represents low abundant stands or few or no squirrels. The red represents lots of squirrels. And you can see as you go across the meters above the ground that 5 meters is not really a lot of difference, but once you start getting into 10, 15, and 20 meters above the ground, you really start to see a difference between those stands that support lots of squirrels and those that have very few. Once you get above that, then you start to run into the canopies, the actual dominant canopies of some of the smaller stands, and it doesn't come out as important. So what we think this really leads to is that of those limiting factors that we looked at, that predation is really a primary limiting factor for flying squirrels. And it's really about a structure predation hypothesis, and that is that the interface between predators and their prey is the multidimensional structure that's up above the canopy, particularly in the mid-story, that becomes important for squirrels. And squirrels are sort of at 2 risks. One of these risks is a detection risk. So if you look at this white line and you think of that as a squirrel gliding through the forest, if you have conditions where you've got either lots of boles, high stem density, or you have the classic multi-layered canopy going through, those conditions result in low detection. Whereas even if you thin lightly in some cases, or the far picture, if you have large gaps, even in natural stands, you start to lose your squirrel populations. The other risk is attack risk. And you know, I've been studying for 20 years. We have a number of anecdotal observations of things going on, but we know that we've seen owls try to attack squirrels up in the tree, and every time the squirrels win. We've also had spotted owls attack squirrels mid-glide, and in each case, the squirrel loses. On the ground, it's sort of mixed. Squirrels have a patagium, so they are somewhat awkward on the ground unless they're running on a solid surface like a log. And so they're very awkward. In some cases, they're also very noisy, but the understory does offer some protection. And then again, we think they're relatively unsafe as they start to go up the tree. So if you have a naked bole and you only have a small crown, it can take a long time for that squirrel to get up to the safety zone. So where do we find lots of squirrels? Well, both of these conditions, high stem density conditions here on the left, that could be young or older forests, or your classic multi-layered but relatively tight canopy stuff with not a lot of major gaps in the stand. Conversely, on the other side, where don't we find squirrels? Well, even in a relatively light thinning, as long as you can start to see through the forest quite a ways, we really start to lose our squirrels. And likewise, even in the oldest, most complex old-growth forests, if you start to have a number of large canopy gaps, you lose your squirrels. So from a management perspective, what about big trees and snags and coarse woody debris? Well, at least in my analysis, looking at a structural gradient, the big trees and snags, which often show up in ANOVA-based studies, were relatively important, but they weren't the most important. And I think what these structures really represent, for flying squirrels anyway, is the ecological processes that lead to complexity. So it's not the big tree per se, but it's the fact that these processes are creating the structural complexities that in some cases are good for the flying squirrels. And it's not that they're not bad. I mean, this is a flying squirrel-centric point of view, because there's certainly other species like birds and other critters that depend on some of these very things. But if you are putting your management eggs in a basket, where are you going to put your resources? It may not be necessarily towards these if your sole goal is managing for spotted owl prey. The red tree vole has a very similar picture in terms of predation being important, but it has some other things going on that it probably needs as well. One of those is a relatively close canopy connectivity. Since they don't really probably like going across the ground except for maybe males in the breeding season, having the ability to cross over to other trees to eat the fresh needles off of the Douglas fir is an important aspect for them. And again, when we thin these areas, that we see these red tree voles drop. Another unique aspect is their nests, which are made out of small needles instead of flying squirrels, which use bigger sticks. And so they have very specialized structures that they need to support those kinds of platforms. So from a management standpoint, at least for the flyers and the red tree voles, that thinning is likely to suppress populations, and probably for several decades. It really depends on how fast that stand accelerates. We're probably seeing better acceleration in younger stands where you don't have a long ways to go from the ground up to the bottom of the canopy. And in a lot of our studies, we've had very small canopies, 67-year-old Douglas fir stands, and a lot to go from the bottom to the top. Also focusing early on mid-story development, and I think this is probably key from the lessons that we've learned, is that if you don't have those species in the understory, if you're trying to go Doug fir under Doug fir, for example, you may consider some of the other shade-tolerant species to grow underneath as well. And if you do have lots of regen, and particularly say like hemlock, you may have to go through and thin early to kind of keep that acceleration going. Anything you can do to bring those next layer of trees up will provide that mid-story level that's important to the squirrels. In terms of a landscape strategies, it's possible to keep some high stem density forests on the landscape, but recognizing that in some cases this can be quite ephemeral. So in some of our studies in Washington, The trees, due to laminated root rot and small wind events, opened up considerably even though we didn't do anything to those, and we lost our squirrels. Another strategy it might be, particularly in fire-prone areas, to create defensible buffers around to at least protect the habitat quality in the short term. If there's a catastrophic fire, it's going to wipe out all your flying squirrels anyway. If you try to thin, it will likely reduce your squirrel numbers. And so one way around that is to try to create some buffers, at least in the short term, within a greater landscape context. And then I also consider the sort of the spatial temporal context of anytime you do a thinning in a particular stand, what about the stands around there? What are they going to do? How are you going to allow permeability of the flying squirrel populations to go across through there, the red tree voles? And so it's really a bigger picture sort of thing, and not just in space, but also we probably need to start looking at longer periods of time, because in some cases it's going to be century or longer before we start to get some effects on some of our treatments that we're looking at for longer term conditions. And finally, exploring options for thinning that might have less deleterious effects. We now have some examples of some thresholds that we could use to actually go in and develop prescriptions that could test this. So as far as what's next, I know from my interest that, I'd like to expand the flying squirrel model that can predict high and low abundances that were focused on Western Washington. These big areas in red are some of the major flying squirrel studies we've had over the last quarter century. The blue dots indicate new studies that are going on starting last year or this year. But you can see that there's large areas in white where we've never really addressed the prey populations at all, and I think there's a good opportunity to do so as we look for funding and for land management partners to kind of help fill in some of these gaps. For red tree voles, these red indicates areas of high relative abundances, the green less so. We're starting to really get a picture of where the red tree voles lie on the landscape, and generally those are lower elevation sites. Most of them are on federal land where we have lots of them, but we know historically that the red tree vole probably occupied a lot more of the state and private land, particularly up as you head up into the northern areas too. So in terms of understanding where our emphasis might be, we're starting to get a much better picture of where that is. Finally, wood rats, which is also another major prey species, we have captured them incidentally. There have been a few published studies, but we really have a big void in our understanding of wood rat ecology in terms of relationships to management actions. And I think this is very important, especially as we transition south and have discussions. For example, if we thinned and remove the flying squirrel populations, would the wood rats come in response to the understory development? And so there's evidence that suggests that that might be the case, at least for one of the two species of wood rats that we have. But clearly an opportunity for a lot more research to understand how that fits into the picture, because it is an important part of prey. So in conclusion, I think we've come a long ways over the last quarter century in our understanding of prey, and we're now getting some metrics that we can actually use both managerially and experimentally to start to test this. And both at a small scale of an individual stand, but also as we sort of get a bigger regional picture about how we want prey populations to flow over space and time as we operate under the Northwest Forest Plan. Thank you.